I guess just a little bit about me and a little bit about the Manchester Airport's journey over the last sort of 18 months. So you can imagine from an aviation perspective, international travel, it's been a bit of a roller coaster to say the least. So my background, I mean, I've been in HR for 25 plus years. Previously I've worked at Barclays, I've worked at Kellogg's, and I've worked for Avon Cosmetics. So I've travelled a lot, but I've never worked in aviation. So just about a year ago, actually, I met our CEO, Charlie Cornish. My role is Chief People Officer, and I guess at that point, we thought we were just coming out of the pandemic. International travel was restarted. Who knew, right? Who knew what the next sort of 12 months would bring? So for us, and I guess for those who don't know us, so we have 3 UK airports: Manchester Airport, Stansted, and East Midlands. We also have a growing US business that sells, if you like, airport services to airports in the US, and kind of e-commerce, revenue management sort of capabilities. So prior to COVID, Manchester Airport Group was thriving. It had done acquisitions. It was looking at future acquisitions, and then everything came to a halt. And I have to say, I guess our shareholders, and we've got quite an interesting sort of setup. So we have a private equity company, IFM, who own a third of the business. Manchester Council own a third. And then the surrounding boroughs, 9 boroughs of Greater Manchester, own the other third. So from a board perspective, very interesting dynamic. Thankfully, the shareholders did invest in the business at the very start of COVID. And has obviously enabled us to continue sort of, despite sort of the lack of travel over the last few months. And I guess, really big decisions had to be made. So before I joined, there was a decision, and it was almost before furlough was announced, there was a decision made to actually do a pay reduction. And obviously our organisation is 85% in collective bargaining, so we've 3 or 4 unions that we work with. That deal was done very, very quickly, and that's kudos, I think, to the leadership team and the unions. But I think we thought, that was just going to be for that very first year. Our pre-COVID travel numbers, our passenger numbers, were around 60 million. At some points over the last year, we were at 0. On average, between 10 and 20%. Versus where we were. So if I give you some figures for July, so in July 2019, we had on a sort of a weekly basis about 6.5 million passengers going through our terminals. This year, it was 1.2. So it's significant. So as you think about how you kind of manage through that pandemic, well, you've got to look at everything. So it's cost, it's looking at the way we work. There was things set up initially that were really about business resilience, so kind of gold, silver, bronze command, really making sure we could keep the airports open. We were classified as key workers. So, in all the time, over the last 18 months, the airports have not closed, although obviously we've had, very few passengers coming through our doors. East Midlands is one of the biggest cargo airports in the UK, so clearly that played a critical role in bringing supplies in. But I think probably the most challenging stuff has been really not having enough work for our colleagues. So at the start of the pandemic, we had about 6,500 colleagues. We're currently tracking at about, we've lost about 1,500 kind of all round. And we've done a combination of, voluntary redundancies, giving people opportunities to leave, career breaks. I mean, you name it, kind of the creativity, and just in terms of trying to find ways to retain people whilst reducing costs. So at certain points across the year, we've probably had 90% of our colleagues furloughed at any one time. So that first year coming through was very tough. And it became interesting this year as we started, as international travel sort of restarted, and we had to think about, again, right-sizing the organisation, and again, thinking about how we create a framework that will save jobs for the future. So, you know, the relations with our unions have been absolutely critical in terms of, you know, getting through this. And we've ended up with this year a second pay agreement. So, you know, this is 2 years of no pay increase. This is 2 years of actual pay reductions. So we built some flexibility into what we did this year so that we could obviously roll up or dial up, dial down, dependent on volumes. We've really had to sort of dig deep from a resilience perspective to kind of keep connected with our colleagues. So you imagine some of our colleagues had not been in the airport for over a year. And then you have a cohort of people who've been keeping the airport open, really kind of working, you know, quite long hours, and obviously sort of taking the pressure of the rest of the organisation. So well-being and resilience has absolutely been high up on my agenda. We did our very first well-being survey in April. And given the fact that we've stayed connected with colleagues on furlough, but many of them on furlough for many months, I wasn't quite sure what response we'd get to the survey. We got a 50% response rate. Now, in my previous world, I guess I would have been disappointed with that. Given where we were, I actually thought it was a good sample. Kind of overall well-being was tracking at about 62% across the total group. And there were sort of really different camps of issues. So for those who had been furloughed, as you can imagine, it was all about actually they were feeling disconnected from the company. They wanted more contact with their line manager, and they clearly were worried about job security. You know, understandably, if I've been out of my workplace for a year, does that mean they don't need me in the future? So that was kind of one theme. And then predominantly for our office-based staff, it was a lot about how to get that work-life balance, all the things we've talked about today. We literally moved to Teams, literally in the space of 3 or 4 days, working with our partners at Microsoft, and it definitely kind of saved what we needed to do. We now have definitely a cohort of people who are very comfortable working at home and want to continue with remote working. And we are sort of testing out, I'm really experimenting with hybrid working, because what we've got, if you think about it, we've got most of the organisation to work needs to physically come into the airports. We've got fixed shifts that obviously line up with our airline schedules. So the key for those colleagues is how do we give more flexibility on choice on rosters, schedules, because what we can't give them is hybrid working, because they've got to be in to do their job. But for office-based workers, we are really looking at how do we make that work. And the way we did that was we categorised roles. So I think actually Stephen talked about, we kind of looked at what are the roles that need to be in because they directly support the airport. What are the roles actually that could continue to work at home? And then you've got a sort of a group in the middle who probably need to be, dial up or dial down. So I've not set any rules yet, and it really purely is an experiment for the next 6 months so that we can learn as we go. But we are kind of working on the principle that on average, the people in that middle group will come into the office around 3 days a week. We've taken the opportunity to do a redesign of our offices. So creating more collaborative space, putting points in for well-being, doing hot desking versus people having fixed desks. We've done sort of, different sort of start and finish times to try and sort of get some flexibility as people come back into our offices, whilst trying to balance the fact that we are a 24/7 operation. So it requires flexibility all round. And we've had some really, really interesting debates as an ExCo, as you can imagine, in terms of how do we ensure that we can service the airports whilst giving people flexibility. So we're hoping to sort of learn as we go. And I'm hoping that it's something that stays, but we right size it for what we need. Clearly, from an engagement perspective, it's definitely been a challenge, and I think we're going to talk about leadership with the panel. For me, I think what really differentiates, the leaders in parts of our organisation, the ones who have done where we've got high engagement, are the leaders who've been high touch with their teams, regardless of whether they've been in, out or furloughed. And I think certainly looking externally, I've seen the companies that separate the best from the average through the pandemic are the companies who've got leaders with the EQ and the flexibility to fine tune what they're doing. So, you know, we're coming out, we've spent a lot of time actually lobbying the government. It's been quite interesting actually when your business has no customers due to decisions that the government is making around sort of travel, you know, the red, amber, green lists. So we've actually kind of pivoted and really done a lot of lobbying and working with the government to try and influence the agenda. And obviously, we're delighted now that actually those vaccinated will not necessarily have to do all the tests that they currently do today, because all of that, of course, reduces passenger confidence to travel. And we get that. But it is interesting because in my previous companies where we've restructured and had to do redundancies, it's because we were moving to a different business model. This was just actually our customers stopped coming through the door. They weren't able to come through the door. So that's been a really interesting sort of pivot in terms of how do you think about things in a different way, and how do you still keep the organisation engaged when they're asking questions like, are there going to be more redundancies, Kath, because, you know, we've still got, the airports are still too quiet. And then, of course, you add in all of the COVID safety measures that you have to put in. So, you know, definitely a roller coaster for us. We're coming out and we're talking about recovery. For us, I think recovery is probably still a couple of years away for us to get back to our pre-COVID passenger numbers. But we are taking that opportunity to reflect and learn, how did we work differently better through the pandemic? Because actually the team came together and achieved a lot. So there's a definite sort of cultural sort of evolution that we're looking to do. And actually we're bringing together in a couple of weeks' time the top sort of 70 leaders to talk about our insights, our learning, and how we move forward, and how we give people reason to believe that aviation is still a great industry to be in, and actually you can still grow and learn. We've had to get really creative. We've not had the budget, you know, budget was really tight, but do you know what? We've set up a mentoring program. We've done stuff on well-being and resilience. We didn't have Sophia Ellis-Bextor, but we did have our fire guys kind of doing some sort of yoga and sort of aerobic sessions. So we've used Teams to kind of bring people in on that. And I think it really shows actually what you can do without actually spending a lot and still having big impact. So I think it's really big. We've been really creative about how to do that. So much more to come, and hopefully, you know, a bright future as people start to travel more. I think obviously last few weeks we've certainly seen some uptake, but definitely kind of a lot of lessons learned, and I think we'll be a better, stronger airport coming out of this. So that brings us to, I think, then the topic in question in terms of leadership, and I guess the types of leaders that we need, you know, to bring people through and, you know, I guess energize people following the pandemic. And Rachel, if you don't mind, I wouldn't mind coming to you first of all. So obviously you're working directly with a lot of clients. What changes have you seen in terms of what organisations are looking for from a leadership perspective? Is it changing?
It is. Thanks, Kath, and thanks for the introduction that you gave. It was fascinating. And yes, I think the simple answer is yes. The needs in leadership are definitely changing, and we're seeing that through our global client base. And I think it's been echoed a lot today already in terms of EQ. We've heard that name or those two letters so many times today. I think it's going to be fascinating in terms of how businesses organise and structure themselves going forward, because we talk about the need for empathetic leaders and for leaders who can have high touch points and who are very people centric, because we've got this dispersed workforce which isn't going away. And yet there is still a big need for technical expertise and innovation and deep subject matter expertise. So how are organisations going to actually evolve to have both of those skill sets, because they're not necessarily, or the people, the lucky people that can combine both sets as a percentage of human nature is not actually that big. So I think there's going to be a huge shift from organizations looking at how they get the market innovation leadership and then the human leadership, and how does that come together. So there is a real urgency in coaching, where coaching can be, and the shift to remote working, I think, has really brought that out, the high touch leaders and so on. But I think that's what we're seeing our global clients really trying to grapple with at the moment.
Thanks, Rachel. And Cary, you touched on it a little bit earlier in terms of how do we prepare future leaders to lead differently. So, you know, you talked about we kind of focus on more the academic side of things. So what would you change in terms of kind of preparing future leaders now to lead? Because I guess, you know, the uncertainty, the unpredictability is only going to continue, isn't it? You know, it's a pandemic now, but it was something different in the future.
Well, it's what Rachel said, I think is quite important. You know, if we really think of it logically, I'm wondering if a pyramidal system that we have is really the future. So for me, you're a good engineer. You're a really good engineer, but to get the status and more money, you have to climb the greasy pole, right? And that means you go into a job. A really good classroom teacher has to try to go for head teacher. I'm wondering if we have the wrong structure in the first place. In other words, Rachel's right. We need people who are good at engineering, but they shouldn't have to go into management. If they don't have the personality to do that, why do we have this system? Why don't we have that system? So that you could earn as much as the CEO by being the best engineer. Why can't you be the best teacher and earn what the head teacher earns? And I have a feeling if it was me, I start to think that way. I think because otherwise we're still going to have the same system. The leaders are not necessarily going to have both those skills they need, which is the people skills and the technical skills. And some people should just stick with the technical because they're not really predisposed to be good at the people. Some are trainable, so they may not be predisposed, but are trainable. But I still think there's a big chunk of people just shouldn't be put near people. You know, they stay in a room, they do the good job as a technical person, but get paid well for it. And until we start rethinking the workplace that way, because I think we're gonna have trouble getting people who have both of them. Personally. And so I would reorganize it that way. I think about doing it that way, but that's a big challenge for HR.
It is.
That's a really big challenge to say to senior leaders, guess what, guys and gals, you're not going to be earning all the big bucks you earned before 25 times what an average worker earns. We're going to pay you less, and we're going to distribute some of that money to people who have good technical skills. I mean, it's a real rethink, you know, a reset.
I think part of the problem is that a lot of organisations, bigger ones, are locked into this through job evaluation systems. Where points mean prizes, basically. So if your job size is bigger, according to job evaluation, it means you're taking on responsibility for budgets, people, and so on. And the more points you accumulate as part of your job, the higher up that greasy pole you go. And obviously, technically, we're supposed to only talk about posts, but actually, a lot of organisations conflate posts and people. So one of the problems is we've got job evaluation, which rewards that. Although I did a bit of work with the safety regulation group of the CAA, for example, a few years ago, where they had job families driven by job evaluation. But the big market outlier for them was test pilots. Test pilots could command massive amount of money in the open market. So they basically introduced a system of market supplements that meant that test pilots were being paid, massively higher wages than the job evaluation system would allow. But it meant they were on a parallel career path. It meant they didn't have to do any people management. They were rewarded for their technical skills. They found a place in the job family system that reflected the demands of their jobs, but market supplements had to be paid in order to get and retain them. So there are mechanisms within current reward systems that allow people who have those detailed and very specific and scarce labour market skills to be rewarded for their technical skills and not have to burden them with people management stuff. So that's one way through it. I mean, I just can come back to the wider issue of leadership, because I think the research on this tells us quite a lot about what works, and there's loads of research about, what is it about leadership in high performance organisations that seem to make a difference. And actually, at one level, it's not that difficult. I mean, we all sort of know this instinctively, it seems to me, but I've just made a list here of the things that the research is saying. A good leader in those circumstances, in a high performance organisation, they secure resources for their team. They skill people up and they provide ongoing coaching and mentoring. They have a consensual approach to get clear goals and objectives, so everyone's clear about what they're doing. And then they back off. They give people space, they trust them, they give them autonomy, they give them discretion. And then there's a sort of loose, tight element to it. So they're backing off, but they're staying close to monitor people's well-being, to stay in touch. And they don't just ask, how are you? Because if you just ask, how are you? The answer you're going to get is, yeah, I'm okay.
I'm okay, yeah.
And I spoke to a CEO of a smallish organisation recently who said that what she does when she has one-to-ones with her direct reports, instead of saying, how are you? She says, tell me one thing at the moment that's giving you loads of frustration as a barrier, and one thing at the moment that's giving you high energy in your job. And of course, that breaks down that sort of automatic, very British response, which is, yes, I'm fine, thank you very much. Let's just talk about, my projects or whatever. And so having those interactions with people, using the skills of EQ and your interpersonal skills to try and probe what is really going on in people's minds and making it open for them to say, actually, this is really hacking me off at the moment, or it's causing me a problem. It means you've got something practical and tangible you can focus on. And a good leader is able to spot that early on and nip it in the bud.
Yeah. So what do you see as the barriers? Because I mean, actually, the way you just summarised it, there you go. Yeah, that all makes sense. What are the barriers? What gets in the way for leaders?
Well,
I mean, there's a little bit about, not all leaders, want to be leaders, and, are they in the right job and they're just a technical expert? But
I think that some leaders are sort of whipping boys or girls. They're what you might call the squeeze middle. And one of my colleagues at IES has been writing about this quite extensively. That actually managers, particularly line managers, are caught. They have pressure from below, from their direct reports, they have pressure from above. Sometimes if they're dealing with suppliers or collaborators or the market, they've got pressure externally. And we don't really consider that line managers, some of them at least, are human beings, that they have psychological needs as well. Their well-being is as much under threat as employees. So the danger is that we say to line managers, you're not doing your job properly, you're really bad, you shouldn't have people management responsibility, and that's completely understandable, but we need to support them. And at the moment, it's partly about doing all the things Cary says and making sure that people are suited to and are positively disposed to managing people, but they need support. And we can't get them to flip overnight to suddenly become empathetic if they're not. And partly that's because historically, in some organisations, we rewarded people for whom being kind is seen as weakness. Yeah. And compassion and kindness are not weaknesses. Yeah. They should be strengths currently in this environment.
Okay, thank you. And Simon, perhaps coming to you, because obviously in the tech space, it's hot talent, like you say, I mean, obviously Microsoft huge, and, it sounds like a lot of people coming to you and looking for roles now. But from a leadership perspective, how do you develop leaders in Microsoft? Because you've got lots of sort of technical experts, and, do you have a sort of twin track, or, professional and technical, or?
Yeah, I mean, culturally, there's a very set methodology, which is basically how you turn up, right? You have a role, and they're very mindful of the fact that if you turn up and you're miserable, aggressive, that culture is going to go through your team and you're going to unsettle people. So, I mean, again, we're very lucky where the energetic people that are in management have that, and sometimes it can be frustrating when people are always happy, but as you say, it is a skill, and I've only just the pennies dropped even when you said it. It is a skill. My my direct manager, hopefully he's listening, my direct manager, always happy, always positive, doesn't do aggression and conflict and stuff like that. That's actually a brilliant attribute, and that's something that we search for. So with the, you know, some of the highest leaders that I speak to on a recruitment basis, they're always masterful politicians. You know, they're always very, very positive. They stand at the front. They also need to stand at the back and just let everyone else do it. There's not a massive culture of you know, look what I've done. It's all team. It's all we, right? It's all we, and that's how leadership's developed. And we have countless courses. I mean, you know, we have a program all the time. So I set aside an hour or two a week where I'm doing all my management training and leadership courses, and it's all probably developed by you, but it is all about the mindset and dealing with different conflicts and having that positivity.
You know, a number of years ago, I went to Japan and spent about a month there. Well, I've been there several times. So I go there and they say, would you like to go see, this was for Japan Airlines, would you like to go see company? I said, yeah, I would like to go see it. And I discovered something I couldn't believe, because Japanese managers, they're the opposite of Anglo-American, which is be decisive, make decisions. Managers there from shop floor to top floor are the listeners. So they listen to their group, the group inputs all their decisions, and then what they do is take it to the next level. So their job isn't to be decisive. They don't come in with ideas. They're not perceived to be people who should be, you know, command and control. I'm in charge here. I got good ideas. I'll discuss it with my team, but then of course, listen to them, but then don't take into account what they said. It's the totally opposite. I thought, wouldn't that be nice in Anglo-American culture or Western European culture to be able to do that? I'm not sure we're capable of it, by the way, but you know what I mean? It was such a kind of different role to be a listener, to take into what people have to say, really take it in. Kindness, really critical. And those kinds of things are usually never, when you're promoting somebody to another manager, are they taken into account? Oh, this guy's a really kind guy. Look at his labor turnover. I mean, nobody leaves him. I mean, he's really a lovely person.
You have to have a likability, don't you? Yeah, you have to have a likability factor within the.
I think you do.
Yeah.
Well, and it's authenticity as well.
Yeah, being an authentic.
If you can fake that, you're going to do really well.
Americans do that quite a lot. Have a nice day as a concept.
But that's the political.
Nice day. They don't really mean have a nice day.
That's the politician element.
Yeah.
That I think some of our senior leaders have, because they can't be that positive all the time. They've got to be normal people. They've got families and you know, deliveries turning up in the middle of things. You know, they're normal people. Yeah. You know, they've got telephone number salaries, but they're just absolutely the same people as you and me. And I think it's masterful. You know,
that's the biggest thing I think the pandemic's brought, is that ability to be authentic, because we were all, if we weren't on front line, we were all
on the same boat, weren't we?
And the door goes, your dog barks, your child screams, whatever, and we're all seeing into each other's, well, till teams brought the brilliant backgrounds anyway, we could all see into each other's kitchens. So I think that was a great leveler in that sense, and that made the kindness piece, which we all had to do, but all of a sudden it was real. It wasn't suddenly a fake kind of, oh, we've been told to do this on a course. It was there, and if we can all keep that as we carry on through this next phase of whatever normal's going to be.
I think that's critical. Will we keep this?
Yeah.
Because we heard, you know, people used to come in on Zoom calls or Teams. Sorry about that. I better say Teams. By the university matches does Teams. All right. Most of the organization, CIPD does Teams, by the way, just to make you feel better. But you get the message. And what you did is you started to learn about human beings, didn't you? Their kids would come in, or I'd say, you know, I really feel low today because my wife's got COVID and she's in the other, we have to isolate her off. I mean, you heard stories. My father died of it, or I mean, really unbelievable stories, didn't we? Something we were all together on. I wish we could hang on to that. I don't know if we will, or whether we'll go back.
Well, there's a phrase.
Roles.
There's a phrase from counselling, isn't there? It's confident self-disclosure. Yeah, that managers have actually been able to reveal a little bit more about themselves. You know, I mean, on Teams calls we have Teams as well. Our director is often sitting in the background with his washing hang out on, you know, on a dryer, or he's got his pajamas on, or whatever. Those sort of things would never happen before. But actually, a lot of leaders have actually felt more confident to disclose things about themselves and to show themselves as individuals.
Yeah, you know, it's funny you say it, Steve, because I was asked I was on the radio at BBC doing a radio interview, and they said, well, what do we do about, how do we get people to talk about their problems? Because mental health is a problem and everybody's keeping it buried. But we know from the ONS survey, everybody's suffering during this period of time. And is the answer just to listen? I said, no, I think the answer is for a line manager to, if you want other people to open up, you better.
Yeah.
In other words, we're all human beings in this room
Yeah.
and online. If we open up, other people will.
Yeah.
But if you stay close, if you just say, well, what's your problem? Oh, really? Oh, yes. It's nice to ask them. But the more I say things like, well, my daughter's had COVID, she's been extremely ill, and I'm worried about long COVID. And she's got 2 young kids, she's a single parent. That actually is my case, you know. And so, short period of time, I hope she's still doing it. So, I mean, if you say that to somebody, then maybe they're prepared to open up and tell you more. The more you just play the role of being interested in them, an active listener, it's not going to work.
You give them permission to
Yeah.
it themselves.
Exactly.
You also get to know their family, like over this year.
And dogs.
Yeah, dogs and the art of delivering a cup of tea behind them and putting it on the desk. But so I mean, when I have my one-to-ones with my guys, it's sort of, you know, how's you know, Debs, how's the kids, how's the dog and stuff like that, and the baby and stuff. And as you say, you do have that wellness chat, and you're actually interested as well. But as I say, it is a fascinating thing, and I hope it does continue. And I really love to say I think it will, because it's authentic. You know, a lot of our leaders, you know, in the GTA function, for example, you've seen their kids. They come and sit on their lap during the course. It's totally acceptable. Yeah. And it humanises them. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, I think the authentic leadership's the key thing. I mean, you know, we did some resilience training, and we did a sort of a set for leaders and a set for colleagues. And in the leaders, we were talking about bringing yourself in. So I opened up, and at the time, actually, my dad was very sick, and I thought, you know, should I say it? And I thought, well, actually, I'm going to do that. And it was a bit emotional. But then the comments I was getting, you know, on the side, people just saying, you know, same here, I'm having that. Yeah. And it really opened up the, you know, the conversation, but use that vulnerability to do it. And for me, I was thinking, you're trying to set the right tone for the workshop, but actually it was probably the best thing I could have done. It wasn't by design. I just thought, actually, I'm just going to do that. Yeah. And it really made a difference. And the number of people then reached out to me and said, you know, I'm sorry to hear about your dad, and I'm having a similar situation. And you somehow get then that personal connection.
It's massively important. Yeah. I mean, I'd just like a little shout out for my friend, Professor Gareth Jones, who we very sadly lost earlier this year in a tragic accident. But he wrote 2 books, which I think are really interesting, which are really relevant. And one was called Why Should Anyone Be Led by You? So it looks at it from a sort of followership perspective. And I think that's a really good question these days. And we, you know, the current environment should put that in sharp focus. And another thing he wrote was about how leadership should work in organisations full of really clever people. You know, 42% or so of the UK economy is the knowledge economy. You know, people aren't going to just jump when you tell them to jump. You need their consent, you need their buy-in, and so on. And that requires a different style of leadership. And what he was talking about there was, you know, if you've got a whole bunch of clever people, you can't just have a control and command and control approach. You need consent. You need to persuade people. You need to, you know, tell them a story, have a narrative about what the organisation is trying to do, and, you know, give them a sense of meaning and purpose and all those sorts of things. And actually, if you do that, you engage them far more. And they have a stake in what the organisation is about, and they will be resilient and have stickability during periods of uncertainty or change. So I think there are some really important things, you know, about leadership and how it's evolving, which have gone in parallel with the pandemic, which we need to hang on to when we come through it.
Yeah, I think there's a chance that we might be able to hang on to it, actually, because we're talking now that we haven't gone back to the old ways in sin. We haven't even figured out what today is, and that's the point, isn't it? We're still experimenting. So while we're experimenting, we have to talk about it. And I know Peter and I mean, we were lucky, joint MDs, we could at least talk to each other as we were figuring stuff out during the pandemic itself, but we still are now. Everybody in the room, all the organisations are, is it 1 day a week? Is it hybrid? Is it this? Is it that? And there's the opportunity to talk through with your colleagues, with your teams, with your business, and show that humility and show that thinking, that transparency of it's not command and control and we've got all the answers overnight. And Goldman Sachs, they may well end up paying for that command and control, because you can see already their brand might be well known, but is it strong and desirable anymore? I would be surprised. And bankers might want to come and work for Goldman Sachs to get it on their CV, but the tech guys that they rely on so enormously won't, because they'll be going to Twitter and to Microsoft.
It also it conveys an image as well. Say you're a company like Goldman Sachs and you say you have to be in the office, and say you decide you want to work for them just to put on your CV for 2 years, which by the way, they did pre-COVID anyway. People didn't work long because of the long hours culture and everything else that they had. But then that would identify you, and no longer is a positive necessarily. The organization, once it goes out and says, we want to do this, you must be in, you must do that, and you go work for them, it might end up not a positive for them if they in their long-term career.
I think he's just he's right in the moment, hasn't he? He's just added Gerald right in the moment when saying that, because it's devastating.
Yeah, it's a brand.
Yeah.
You have a brand and you're starting to change your brand out there, you know, and you've got to be very careful as an organization how you do that.
Yeah. And it's interesting, because I think what certainly in the conversations that we've been having around hybrid working, and we've obviously got a dilemma, we've got an operational part of the business that's 24/7 and therefore fixed shifts related to airline schedules, and then office-based staff where we are experimenting. And probably the key things have been that people want flexibility and choice. So they're not saying actually they don't want to come back in. They just want to choose when they come and why they're coming in to do that. So we're sort of changing that conversation to, you know, come in with purpose. So actually, if there's a team meeting and you need to collaborate, you come in and do that together versus having half and half, you know, on Teams or in the room. We've put some guidelines in and said, actually, if not everybody's in the room, do Teams, because then actually it's from an inclusivity perspective, it's much better. But actually kind of think about your day and your week. And we've had people saying, well, you know, I wouldn't mind Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in the office and, you know, Monday, Friday at home. And we've said, let's not do fixed days. Let's just literally see how this plays out. And we may end up in a rhythm, you know, you know, and this sort of, you know, deferred start and finish times, I think will help. When we've said, let's do, you know, 10 till 4 for meetings, kind of broadly, kind of core hours. Interestingly, I think you were talking about the wellbeing days. I think that we've sort of said, actually, we've been doing wellbeing Wednesdays, but every month having a day where actually there are no meetings other than it's the wellbeing, volunteering or something like that. And I think those things start to matter.
You know, Swedish companies have been doing that for 20 years. They're called mental health days. They don't call them well-being days, but you just call up and saying, instead of saying there's leaves on the line and I can't get in, or some excuse that a lot of people give because they want to stay off, they just call up and say, I'm just having a mental health day. I just need a break. I feel burned out.
The irony is as well, of course, of these well-being days have landed brilliantly, but I didn't take 30 days off. You know, I probably only took 15 days off last year. So it's not a case that I think Microsoft lost productivity, because I don't think people took their holiday or do take their holidays anyway. And I think that's a cultural thing. But the masterful way that they gave you 5 wellness days, and what they probably said is use 5 days of your holiday. It wasn't actually, I don't think anybody I know took 30 days off.
So trying to pivot the conversation to a more future focus then, what, you know, if I think about succession planning for leaders particularly, you know, what's the right time horizon? You know, we kind of look, you know, 1 to 2 years out, is it 5 years out, is it beyond? How do we build that sort of pipeline for the future? And what do you think is the right time horizons? I don't know if there's a particular view on that.
I think it depends on the business.
Yeah.
You know, some businesses can do this. You know, I mean, back in the old days, the civil service had a sort of in at the bottom all the way through. You know, some of the big oil companies had sort of workforce planning mechanisms that could spot potential at graduate recruitment level, and they could plot someone's career through different functional jobs in order for them to be ready for a more senior job later on. I think that still happens up to a point, but I think it's a lot more flexible these days. So I think you're looking for sort of traits. I think the ability to predict over the long term a good leader is still quite hard.
Yeah.
One of the stories that I heard from the civil service is that they have this fast track scheme, and they do all sorts of psychometric assessments and, you know, leaderless groups and intro exercises and all these fantastic psychometric exercises. When they look back over 30 years of their data to see which of those exercises was the best predictor of future success, it wasn't any of those exercises. It was the discussion at the end where they got everyone on the assessment centre together and they asked them, just tell us which amongst you, now you've been together for 3 days, do you think is most likely to succeed? And it was that peer assessment that was the best predictor of future career
That's
success.
probably the likability and things like that, things you don't even think about.
Yeah.
It's not the career thing that
No,
you're
it's
doing.
back to character and yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the character stuff.
Yeah.
As a psychologist, I would say that. It's the personality things, people you like, who listen to you, who don't do command.
But it's also
control.
people with a harder edge, people with a persistence.
Yeah.
You know, people
Who may
that-
be achievement orientated,
Yeah,
but do
absolutely.
it with a personality,
Yeah.
with a soft, with a glove on a hard hand.
Yeah.
But that's the way they do it.
I mean, we have a very open conversation about this, and we sort of give the time limit at like 4 years, right? So a year to get into it and a 3-year plan to execute, and then you can move on with no problem. And it's very openly discussed. So some of the leaders that we've discussed their succession with, when they're coming up to 4 years, it's a conversation that's very open and had. So applying for roles internally is not frowned upon in the slightest. It's totally acceptable.
One of the risks of doing it over too long a term is that you end up baking in an assessment of someone's potential that stays with them, and doesn't give them a chance to change or a chance for other people to come in. So succession plans that, you know, almost anoint people as high potential, it's called the Crown Prince syndrome, mean that people focus on looking good rather than performing well as they go through the system.
And that happens early too.
It does.
Way too early.
And it can exclude women, particularly if they're taking career breaks. So it's not a particularly diverse or inclusive approach. So the danger is that you're making a sort of long-term bet on someone who shows high potential when they join the organisation or in the first 2 years. But it's not a very flexible approach. So I think we have to have a more dynamic definition of what succession and potential.
But that's what they do. Unfortunately,
They do,
almost
too
all
many.
organizations at a young age pick the people they think are going to and let's see how people develop. And the thing about gender is really critical here, and ethnic minorities as well. I mean, we just have to be more fluid and let it develop.
And bringing people in at critical career points as well, rather than just kind of a
And also, to get that job that's in the middle might be different than the job that's in the next one up, and the next one. It requires different personality traits as well. A match between the person and the job.
Yeah, thank you. I think Peter is waving at us, so I think
I've been waving for a little bit.
Sorry.
We're going to do 1 or 2 questions off the live stream, and then let the live streamers go, and then we'll do a couple more questions in the room, and then for those in the room, we are feeding you downstairs at the Laureate restaurant. For those that can stay, appreciate not everybody may be able to. So do you want to fire over the
Our online question then, Jalal, is pretty much open to everyone on the panel, whoever wants to answer. What's the new approach towards well-being from companies?
What's the new approach? Okay, well, I think it's the strategic approach. Have it at the top of the agenda. Incidentally, Microsoft, it happens to be in my national forum, by the way, as it transpires. But I think that's the new approach is not to do bean bags, ping pong tables, sushi at lunch, and mindfulness.
Yeah.
It's not about that.
Fruit and
That's the
Pilates.
new approach. That's the old approach.
Yeah.
Low hanging fruit, isn't it?
It's the fruit and Pilates approach, and I think, you know, Dr. Paul Litchfield from used to be chief medical for VT, coined the phrase fruit and Pilates to basically mean, you know, seeing well-being as an extension of your staff benefits. And if it's a staff benefit, you don't measure outcomes, you measure take-up. You're not interested if you offer gym membership, whether or not that makes a difference to people's well-being or their attendance. You just measure how many people go, and that's the wrong way. The uncomfortable answer to the question is it means embedding this much more systemically in the way we manage people at work. So well-being isn't a separate initiative. You know, well-being comes from the intrinsic content of the job, how you're led, you know, the extent to which you have a psychological connection with the organisation. And whether as a business you're able to deliver good quality work for people. You know, good old Frederick Hertzberg, remember him?
Oh yeah, I remember.
He said, if you want people to do a good job, give them a good job to do. And that's absolutely on the money. And that should be the core principle of our well-being strategy going forward.
But there is no one size fits all.
No.
So for one organization, the strategy, take the construction industry, for example. I work with one of the big construction companies. I have worked with them. And one of the problems they had is they said, we're doing all this strategic stuff about line managers, about flexible working. They were doing all this kind of stuff. And they were an organization of, say, 7,000 employees. But they have 100,000 supply chain employees that they employ.
Yeah.
They said, if we just do it for us, and we're building a huge billion-pound building, and the supply chain lets us down, the small SMEs that work for us, the painters, the electricians, the rest of it, who we bring in, then it's going to fail, and we're going to all be in trouble. So we have to go down the supply chain. So that's novel. We have to think it through. But it is a strategy rather than the low-hanging fruit.
I'm doing some work with John Lewis Partnership. We've got a thing called the Better Jobs campaign, which is partly about their own employees, but they're explicitly rolling out to their UK suppliers. So they're saying we have a template of what good work means, and it includes well-being. And if you want to be one of our suppliers, we'll work with you to develop along these criteria for good jobs. And it's been so far very successful, and they're looking to roll this out with their suppliers in India and China. So what they're saying is we've got a proactive, positive message about what well-being, good quality work, staff development.
Because we've done it internally.
Exactly.
Now we're going to.
If you want to be a supplier, then
supply chain.
And it absolutely has to go beyond the boundaries of the organisation.
Yeah.
Yeah. One more piece, did you say?
Final question online. Have you observed any effective strategies or organisations are applying to any of the challenges you've raised?
Everything you just said.
Well, yeah, a lot of them are. I mean, the good news is even pre-COVID, they were starting this.
Yeah.
And yeah, exactly. I mean, if you take, for example, BP on mental health, the CEO of BP has outwardly said he had depression during his life. It's a very important issue for me. He got to the top still with problems of mental health problems. Antonio Herrera at Lloyd's Bank. In fact, it wasn't the science that changed the organization. It was the top people admitting that they had problems in their life. And believe me, you know,
we very purposely put it into all our meetings as well. You know, on the agenda, it's mental well-being. You remind them and ingrain it in them that it's okay. You know, talk to people. Do you know the phone numbers? Do you know that you can talk about it? So it's changed from a personal taboo. In some cultures, it's a bit like, you know, with British people, they're very stiff upper lip. You know, you don't talk about it, but that taboo has been dropped, and you're allowed to talk about it.
Yeah, and I would say it's not a one size fits all, even within one organisation, because I've got very diverse sort of colleagues who need very different things. So a much more segmented approach, I think, is the way forward.
But it's positive. Let's be positive, because to be honest with you, it's not the odd organization that's doing something. A lot of them are, and they've been doing it pre-COVID. All this has done is accelerated it. Because hybrid has accelerated. Mental health has been a big issue. The line manager has been a big issue pre-COVID. All it's done is this whole pandemic has accelerated. We have a lot of good examples in the UK.
But we mustn't lose the momentum once the pandemic is over.
No, that's the important thing.